What does it mean when soldiers, not police officers, become the face of safety in the nation's capital? When the heart of our democracy is patrolled by military boots instead of community guardians, we must ask, are we protecting our freedoms or quietly surrendering them? Imagine waking up to the sound of heavy engines rumbling through quiet streets, a low mechanical growl that drowns out the familiar chorus of morning life. Instead of the clink of coffee cups or the chatter of neighbors heading to work, the day begins with the slow crawl of military vehicles, their armored frames casting long shadows across city blocks, still damp with dawn. Soldiers in uniform stand where you might expect to see a crossing guard or a street vendor. Their boots press against the same pavement where children play in the summer, where commuters rush past in the fall, where the very rhythms of civilian life have always been uninterrupted by the machinery of war. It is not a war zone, and yet the symbols of war are suddenly present. There is a stark contrast between the iconic landmarks of Washington, D.C., the monuments to democracy, the marble domes and columns, and the unmistakable sight of armed troops moving between them. This juxtaposition does something to the mind. It pulls at the threads of normalcy, unraveling the comforting idea that the capital is only a place for debate, governance, and civic life. When the military presence becomes the first thing you see in the morning, it does not just signal a change in security measures. It signals a change in atmosphere, in the unspoken social contract between the governed and those who govern. For decades, citizens have associated these streets with the processes of representation, protest, and public expression, all playing out under the protection of local law enforcement. But when those uniforms are replaced by fatigues, the conversation changes before a single word is spoken. It becomes harder to see the city as a purely civilian space, harder to separate the functions of government from the optics of control. The sight alone raises questions before any official statement is read. What happened overnight? What danger is so great that soldiers must take the place of police officers? What does it mean when the tools of foreign defense are placed in the heart of domestic life? This imagery is not just a backdrop. It is a statement in itself, shaping how residents interpret the events of the day. For some, it may evoke feelings of safety, a belief that order will be restored. For others, it may create unease, a sense that the threshold between civilian and military authority has been crossed without warning. Either way, it is impossible to ignore. The very presence of soldiers transforms the streets into a kind of stage where power is not just exercised, but displayed, where the visual language of governance shifts from dialogue to defense. It is in these moments defined by what we see before we understand, that political decisions take on their deepest emotional weight, not through the laws they pass, but through the images they etch into the public mind. We are often presented with explanations that frame government actions as necessary responses to urgent crises, statements designed to reassure the public that decisions are made solely in the interest of safety and order. But when the facts on the ground seem to diverge from the narrative, it is critical to question what really motivates such moves. The assertion that deploying the National Guard is about combating rising crime and disorder may sound straightforward, yet the reality is often far more complex. It forces us to examine the difference between appearances and substance, between political messaging and empirical evidence. When officials claim an emergency, it is easy to accept that as the final word. Yet public policy must be rooted in truth, and truth requires scrutiny. Numbers matter. Crime statistics are a key piece of this puzzle, offering an objective measure of safety and risk. Official reports show that violent crime in Washington, D.C., has actually declined sharply in recent years, reaching levels not seen for decades. If the data indicate progress, why then is there talk of chaos? Why is there a sudden surge of military forces patrolling the streets? The discrepancy raises the possibility that this is not a simple case of responding to a crisis, but rather a calculated political response designed to shape public perception. Fear is a powerful tool. It can motivate action, unify communities, or conversely, it can be wielded to justify extraordinary measures that might otherwise be unacceptable. When fear, rather than facts, drives policy, the consequences ripple far beyond immediate security concerns. It alters the relationship between citizens and their government, potentially eroding trust and civic engagement. Moreover, the rhetoric around lawlessness often serves to obscure deeper social and economic issues. Poverty, homelessness, and systemic inequality do not disappear simply because the National Guard is called in. Instead, these problems demand comprehensive solutions rooted in community support and effective governance. When the response instead centers on militarized presence, it signals a shift away from addressing root causes and toward controlling symptoms. This kind of approach can exacerbate tensions, fueling division rather than fostering understanding. The question we must ask is whether the narrative of crisis is being employed sincerely or strategically. Is this an effort to genuinely protect the public, or is it a means to consolidate authority and send a message? When facts contradict the narrative, skepticism is not cynicism, it is responsibility. In a democracy, citizens deserve transparency and honesty from those in power. They deserve policies guided by evidence, not by political expediency or the desire to project strength. Ultimately, recognizing the difference between fact and fear is essential to preserving the delicate balance between security and freedom, between governance and democracy. Official crime statistics serve as a fundamental benchmark for understanding the safety and security of any community, providing an empirical foundation upon which policies and public perceptions should ideally be built. In the case of Washington, D.C., recent data paints a surprising picture that sharply contrasts with the rhetoric justifying the deployment of the National Guard. According to multiple authoritative sources, violent crime in the city has actually declined to levels not seen in decades, reflecting years of concerted efforts by local law enforcement, community organizations, and city leadership. This downward trend challenges the narrative of escalating danger and rampant disorder that has been presented to justify our extraordinary federal intervention. The decline is not marginal but significant, with key metrics such as homicides, assaults, and robberies showing marked reductions year over year. These figures suggest that the city is moving in a positive direction, improving the quality of life for its residents rather than descending into chaos. The importance of acknowledging this data cannot be overstated because it directly contradicts claims of a crime emergency that would warrant the presence of military forces on city streets. When official records indicate safety is improving, the rationale for deploying the National Guard becomes not only questionable, but potentially misleading. This disconnect raises concerns about the motivations behind the decision and the potential use of fear to justify political aims. Furthermore, the reliability and transparency of crime data are vital to maintaining public trust. When government agencies provide clear, accurate information, they empower citizens to make informed judgments and hold their leaders accountable. However, when policy actions appear disconnected from available evidence, it fosters skepticism and suspicion, undermining the very legitimacy those actions seek to uphold. Critics argue that the crime data has been selectively interpreted or overshadowed by isolated incidents, which, while serious, do not represent the broader reality of public safety. This selective focus risks distorting the public's understanding and creating an exaggerated sense of threat. It also diverts attention from effective community-based strategies that have contributed to the positive trends seen in the data. In addition, the emphasis on deploying military-style forces overlooks the complex social, economic, and structural factors that contribute to crime. Long-term solutions require investments in education, housing, mental health services, and economic opportunity, not simply increased policing or militarization. The contradiction between declining crime statistics and the escalation of security measures therefore reveals a tension between evidence-based policymaking and symbolic political gestures. This tension is central to debates about the appropriate role of government in maintaining order, respecting civil liberties, and building trust with the communities it serves. Ultimately, the data calls into question the justification for extraordinary federal intervention, suggesting instead that such actions may be more about optics and control than about responding to an actual surge in violence. Understanding this discrepancy is crucial for any meaningful discussion about public safety and the future of governance in the nation's capital. Washington, D.C. stands as a unique symbol in the American political landscape. More than just a city, it is the embodiment of self-governance and democratic principles. Its very existence rests on a delicate balance between federal oversight and local autonomy, a balance that has evolved over decades, but remains a source of ongoing debate. The city's residents and elected officials have long sought the ability to manage their own affairs, to shape policies that reflect the needs and values of their community without undue interference from distant powers. This aspiration for local control is enshrined in laws and traditions that recognize the importance of empowering citizens to govern themselves. When federal authority steps in to override local leadership, even temporarily, it challenges the fundamental idea that those who live in a place should have the primary say in how it is run. The deployment of the National Guard and the assumption of control over the DC Metropolitan Police by the federal government represent more than just security measures. They symbolize a shift in power dynamics that strikes at the heart of democratic governance. Such actions raise urgent questions about whose interests are being served and who gets to make decisions affecting the lives of ordinary residents. This tension is especially pronounced in Washington, D.C., where the majority of the population lacks full voting representation in Congress and relies heavily on local government for representation. Federal intervention can be perceived as a further erosion of the city's already limited self-determination, deepening feelings of disenfranchisement among its citizens. Moreover, local officials argue that they are best positioned to understand the complexities of their community's challenges. Their proximity to the people they serve allows for more nuanced, responsive, and culturally informed policies. Replacing or superseding local law enforcement with federally controlled forces risks undermining this responsiveness, substituting broad, one-size-fits-all approaches for tailored solutions. This is not just a matter of political sovereignty. It is about the efficacy and legitimacy of governance. When the people see their elected leaders sidelined, their trust in institutions may wane, weakening the social fabric that holds communities together. The presence of federal troops can also alter the character of public space, transforming neighborhoods into zones of surveillance and control rather than centers of civic life. Beyond the local impact, this move has broader implications for the balance of power between federal and state or local governments across the country. If a precedent is set that allows the federal government to unilaterally assume control over municipal policing under broad definitions of emergency, it may open the door to similar interventions elsewhere. This could disrupt the principle of federalism that undergirds the American political system, which relies on a division of responsibilities and respect for local autonomy. The dialogue about Washington, D.C.'s governance is therefore not isolated. It resonates with ongoing national conversations about policing, democracy, and civil rights. At stake is the question of how power is distributed and exercised within the United States, and how citizens can retain meaningful influence over the policies that shape their daily lives. In this context, protecting local control is about more than political jurisdiction. It is about safeguarding the democratic values that define the nation itself. Deploying military forces on American soil, particularly within a city like Washington, D.C., is a move that carries profound implications and should never be treated as routine or trivial. Such actions have historically been reserved for exceptional circumstances, moments of genuine crisis that demand extraordinary responses to protect lives and maintain order. The normalization of these measures risks eroding the very principles that separate a free society from one governed by force. When armed troops replace or supplement civilian police forces, the symbolism is unmistakable. It signals a shift from community-based law enforcement to a posture of control and coercion. This shift can alter the relationship between citizens and their government in fundamental ways, breeding fear and suspicion rather than trust and cooperation. The use of military presence in domestic settings is fraught with legal, ethical, and social challenges. The Post Comitatus Act, for example, limits the use of federal military personnel in enforcing domestic laws, reflecting a long-standing commitment to keeping the military separate from civilian affairs. Although there are exceptions and specific legal mechanisms that allow temporary deployments, these are designed to be narrow in scope and duration. When such deployments become more frequent or are justified on tenuous grounds, they risk undermining the legal framework that protects civil liberties. Beyond legalities, the optics of militarization are powerful. Streets lined with soldiers in combat gear, armored vehicles rolling past historic landmarks, and checkpoints manned by troops transform the urban landscape into something unfamiliar and intimidating. This atmosphere can have a chilling effect on public life, discouraging peaceful assembly, protests, and everyday interactions that are vital to a vibrant democracy. It also risks escalating tensions rather than calming them, as communities may perceive such shows of force as hostile or oppressive rather than protective. The long-term consequences of normalizing military deployments extend into the realm of governance and public trust. When citizens come to expect that military involvement is a standard response to social issues, it shifts the political dialogue away from prevention dialogue and reform toward enforcement and control. This shift can stifle meaningful conversations about the root causes of problems like crime, poverty, and inequality. It may also incentivize governments to rely on force rather than invest in community-based solutions. History offers cautionary tales of societies where militarization of public safety became the norm, often leading to cycles of violence, suppression of dissent, and erosion of democratic institutions. The challenge is to balance the legitimate need for security with the imperative to preserve civil rights and community trust. Extraordinary measures require extraordinary justification. When the threshold for deploying troops lowers, the line between protecting citizens and infringing on their freedoms blurs. It becomes harder to maintain the checks and balances that ensure power is exercised responsibly and proportionately. For the health of the democracy, it is vital that such deployments remain exceptional, closely scrutinized, and subject to clear limitations. They must never become tools for political signaling or coercion disguised as public safety. In this light, normalizing military presence on city streets is not just a policy choice. It is a potential threat to the very fabric of democratic society. When a government takes the extraordinary step of deploying the National Guard within its own borders, especially in a high-profile location such as the nation's capital, it sets a precedent that reverberates far beyond the immediate moment. This action signals to citizens, local governments, and political actors that the threshold for federal intervention in municipal affairs can be shifted, sometimes abruptly and without broad consensus. Precedents matter in politics and governance because they establish patterns of behavior and expectations for how power can be exercised in the future. Once a particular action is taken, especially one that alters established norms, it becomes easier for subsequent leaders to justify similar or even more expansive interventions. The concern is not merely theoretical. History is replete with examples where measures initially introduced as temporary or exceptional became embedded into routine practice, eroding democratic safeguards over time. In the context of deploying troops to cities, the danger lies in transforming what should be a rare last resort into a common response to political or social challenges. This could lead to a slippery slope where federal authority overrides local governance, not only in moments of clear and present danger, but also in politically charged situations or minor disturbances. The ramifications extend beyond Washington, D.C. Other cities and states could face similar federal takeovers under the guise of emergencies, disrupting the principle of federalism, the system that balances power between national and local governments. If the federal government can assert control whenever it deems necessary, local voices risk being marginalized and the democratic process weakened. This shift threatens the autonomy of municipalities to develop tailored policies that address their unique circumstances and community needs. Furthermore, the precedent of deploying armed forces domestically impacts public trust and civic engagement. Citizens may come to view their local governments as powerless or subordinate, diminishing the sense of agency and participation that fuels democracy. When residents see troops on their streets, especially if those troops answer to federal rather than local authority, it can foster a sense of alienation and mistrust. Politically, the precedent can be exploited as a tool for partisan advantage. Future administrations might invoke similar powers selectively, targeting cities or regions governed by political opponents or those that do not align with the federal agenda. This weaponization of emergency powers could deepen divisions and undermine the neutrality expected of government institutions. At the same time, setting a precedent of federal intervention can discourage investment in community-based solutions to social problems. If the default response becomes militarized enforcement rather than prevention and engagement, it detracts from efforts to address underlying causes of unrest or crime. This shift could exacerbate social tensions and erode the effectiveness of public safety strategies. The establishment of such a precedent also raises questions about the balance between security and liberty. Democratic societies must constantly negotiate the tension between protecting citizens and preserving their freedoms. When extraordinary powers become normalized, this balance tips often in favor of security at the expense of civil liberties. This shift can diminish constitutional protections and set the stage for further erosions of rights. In sum, The decision to deploy the National Guard in the nation's capital is not an isolated event. It carries significant implications for the future governance of the country. It challenges long-standing norms about the limits of federal power and the role of local autonomy. Recognizing the potential consequences is essential for any thoughtful discussion about democracy, power, and the rule of law. In an era marked by deep political divisions, it is crucial to rise above partisan lines and approach issues with a broader perspective rooted in shared values and democratic principles. The deployment of the National Guard to Washington, D.C. is not simply a matter for one political party or another to claim as victory or defeat. It is a challenge that affects the entire nation and every citizen who values the foundations of democracy. When decisions of such magnitude are framed strictly through the lens of party allegiance, we risk losing sight of what truly matters. Upholding the rule of law, respecting local governance, and protecting civil liberties. This issue demands a collective response that transcends ideology and emphasizes common ground. Citizens from all political backgrounds should be united in questioning any action that undermines local control or militarizes civilian spaces without clear and compelling justification. It is not about supporting or opposing a particular leader, but about safeguarding the institutions that enable democratic governance to function effectively and fairly. Recognizing this nonpartisan imperative requires acknowledging the shared interests that cut across political divides. Everyone benefits when communities feel safe, when governments are accountable, and when citizens have a meaningful voice in how they are governed. Conversely, when extraordinary measures are taken without broad consensus, it undermines trust in public institutions and exacerbates polarization. Partisan framing can obscure these shared stakes, turning legitimate concerns into political ammunition and making it harder to find common solutions. The focus, therefore, should shift from scoring political points to fostering dialogue and understanding. Open conversations about the implications of federal intervention in local policing, the data on crime, and the importance of respecting constitutional boundaries are essential. Such dialogue must include diverse perspectives, including those of local officials, community leaders, legal experts, and everyday citizens who live with the consequences of these decisions. When the issue is depoliticized, it becomes easier to engage in critical thinking and hold leaders accountable regardless of their party affiliation. A nonpartisan approach also encourages vigilance against the misuse of emergency powers for political gain. History shows that governments can be tempted to invoke crises as pretexts for expanding authority or silencing opposition. Citizens united by democratic principles can act as a check on such tendencies, demanding transparency, evidence-based policymaking, and respect for civil rights. Furthermore, nonpartisan scrutiny helps to preserve the legitimacy of law enforcement and government institutions. When actions are perceived as politically motivated, they risk eroding public confidence and cooperation, which are vital for effective governance and community safety. Building trust requires consistency, fairness, and adherence to shared norms that transcend partisan disagreements. It is also important to recognize that democratic resilience depends on active participation from all sectors of society. When citizens refuse to be divided by party loyalty on fundamental issues, they strengthen the collective capacity to protect democratic norms and prevent abuses of power. Ultimately, this shared responsibility extends beyond any single event or policy decision. It is about cultivating a political culture where the health of democracy is prioritized over partisan advantage, where dialogue replaces division, and where respect for the rights and voices of all citizens guides governance. Approaching the deployment of the National Guard and related actions through this lens not only clarifies the stakes, but also points toward more constructive paths forward that honor the principles upon which the nation was founded. When confronted with decisions that shape the very fabric of a nation's democracy, it is essential for citizens to reflect deeply on the kind of country they want to live in and leave to future generations. The deployment of the National Guard to Washington, D.C., especially under contested circumstances, forces us to confront this profound question. At its core, this issue is not just about immediate security or political maneuvering. It is about defining the relationship between government and the governed, between authority and freedom. The America that many envision is one where safety and liberty coexist harmoniously, where citizens feel protected without feeling oppressed, where laws are enforced with respect for individual rights, and where the power of the state is checked by robust democratic institutions. Yet actions that place soldiers on the streets of civilian neighborhoods challenge this vision. They provoke questions about the boundaries of governmental power and the limits that must be respected to preserve freedom. Citizens must consider whether the presence of armed forces patrolling city streets represents a necessary safeguard or a step toward normalization of militarized governance. This reflection extends beyond political affiliations or immediate reactions to events. It is about the principles and values that define the nation's identity. The question, is this the America we want to build, asks us to evaluate how we balance competing needs, the need for security and order with the equally vital need for freedom and dignity. It challenges us to think about how government decisions affect the daily lives of ordinary people, their trust in institutions, and their sense of belonging in the democratic project. Moreover, this question prompts consideration of how such measures impact marginalized communities and those who have historically been subjected to over-policing and systemic inequalities. Do military deployments enhance their safety, or do they deepen fears and reinforce divisions? How does this shape the social contract and the promise of equal protection under the law? Reflecting on the America we want also involves imagining the long-term consequences of today's choices. Decisions made in moments of crisis can set precedents that shape governance for years or decades. Citizens must ask whether temporary measures might become permanent fixtures, altering the landscape of civic life in ways that constrain future freedoms. This contemplation is not merely theoretical. It demands active engagement, dialogue, and advocacy. It calls on individuals and communities to voice their concerns, hold leaders accountable, and participate in democratic processes that determine public policy. Ultimately, the answer to this question will influence the trajectory of democracy itself. If the response favors militarization and federal control at the expense of local autonomy and civil liberties, it may lead to a future where government power is expanded and dissent suppressed. Conversely, affirming a commitment to democratic principles can inspire policies that prioritize community-based solutions, transparency, and respect for human rights. The choice is in the hands of the people, who must weigh competing interests and values informed by facts, history, and vision. This decision will resonate beyond the immediate moment, shaping the identity and integrity of the nation for generations to come. In the end, the presence of the National Guard in our streets is more than a security measure. It is a symbol of how we choose to balance power, safety, and freedom. Let us remain vigilant, question narratives, and stand united in protecting the democratic values that define us. The future of our democracy depends on the choices we make today.